So our next speaker today is Mander. Luca presented his initial findings of his work at Humber Nature Forum meeting. Must have been two, maybe 3 years ago now. So it's great to have him back to present some more detail on his work. So I'll hand over to Luca, 15 minutes, and then please feel free to keep asking questions in the chat, both for Wes or for Luca once his talk begins. Over to you, Luca.
Yeah, thank you, Darrell, and thank you, Jackson, really, for the invite. I'm Luca. I'm interested in weather and weather ecology and the impact of environmental changes and human activity on waders. So the findings here I'm presenting are part of a PhD, which is funded by Hull University and the BTO, and in the fieldwork and has been done in collaboration with the Humber Weather Running Group. So I'll be talking about GPS technology and Curlew. So Curlew is a species of waders. I realize some of you have already kind of heard the talk already. I gave a couple of years ago, some update recently. So waders, as you know, the Humber is located along this East Atlantic flyway. So it's used by waders, shorebirds, birds moving along between the breeding ground and the wintering ground. And because waders are long-distance migrants, they rely on different resources at different times of the years. And so environmental changes happening on some of the habitats really can be carried over onto the next stage of life cycle. So, for example, birds leaving Africa with a low fitness might kind of hamper the chance of survival on the breeding ground, or that might reduce their kind of ability to produce offspring, and vice versa. Bird leaving the breeding ground with a low weight, this might reduce their survival on the wintering ground. So understanding movement is key really to understand the impact of climate change and environmental activities on waders. And we could track birds through modern telemetry using geolocators. So they're very small device, basic device that record light intensity and time, 1/3 of a gram, and they can be fitted to a leg of a wader, for example. But the bird needs to be recaptured, so we can download the data and process the data. The data will give us, position of the bird, but the accuracy is not great. It's 150 kilometers. But a lot of great studies have been done really on using geolocator and unraveling the long distance migration of waders. There's also the Doppler PTT, so good example that the work's been done on Curlew with the BTO, and that's just a device that transmits a signal to a passing GPS, and from there we can determine the location of the bird, and it's live information, and it's using this Argos satellite which are dedicated to environmental monitoring. There's also the GPSs really that use a multitude of GPS. They use a multitude of GPS to record position. So they're very low in weight. Minimum weight starts at 1 gram really, and they can either archive the data, so we could store the data, or they could store the data but also transmit the data using a GSM network, or so they can transfer to the mobile network, for example, or to a base station via UHF signal. So the GPS now are very dominant in the market, and they due to the miniaturization and mass production, they're getting smaller and cheaper to fit. So there's quite a lot of study now using GPS on birds, on bird of medium to large sizes really. Obviously, we can't really fit a GPS tag to a very small pasturine. So why Curlew? So Curlew is a near-threatened wader species because of long-term decline, whereas it's a 50% decline in the last 25 years on the breeding ground in the UK. But the UK is also very important for wintering Curlew, supporting half of the population, the European world population. And most of our wintering birds come from Scandinavia and wintering on the East Coast. And the estuary is one of the top 7 estuaries in the UK really for wintering curlew. And why the Humber for the study? Well, it's a low-lying estuary and protected by hard defenses, and we, because of sea level rise and coastal squeeze, we need to offset the loss of tidal flood due to sea level rise and create new sites, these compensatory sites, or this management site really called Pollumtree or Wellick. And we need to see how waders really use these sites. But it's also the land around the estuary, the functional link land, which is contributing to kind of maintaining and restoring the Humber in favorable status really. It's just understand a bit more how waders use the function, that land which is connected to the tidal flat, really, the terrestrial fields. So in any tracking study, the first challenge is to catch bird, so catch waders. So I've been doing this with the Humber wader ringing group. So we've been using mist net and catching curlew, and also other waders at a number of sites on the estuary. So mainly on Wellick pools, on pools at night in the salt marsh, but also on using cannon nets on coastal grassland field. So we put color rings on waders to monitor the movement and the survival. That's very important because waders are long-lived bird. Curlew has a lifespan of 10 to 20 years, so we can recite the birds many times and get some great data on really on survival and movement. There's I just put a link there for the watertail WordPress from a site from Grant Appleton really, because it just shows the value of color ringing really for monitoring survival and movements. But we're interested in tagging GPS, so we're putting this GPS tag. So we fitted curlew with a total of 23 curlew with GPS tags. So the GPS tags really record the position of the bird for every 90 minutes, and that GPS tag is glue mounted to the back of the bird and will fall off after a couple of months. So we only get data for 2 months really during the winter. We're interested in the winter movements. That tag really transmits the data back to a base station, so we don't need to recapture the birds. I'll show you a small animation really of a snippet of the data we collected. So we've been capturing bird at Wellick, north bank of the estuary, and at Long Barn Marshes near Kinsey. So we had a small pilot study in 2016 with the Humber wading group, and capturing the last birds in the last 3 years as well with a group. And what's clear really is just that site fidelity really that is highlighted in the animation really. The curlew at Wellick are remain there for the first few months really. And you can see the movement up and down the shore relates to the tidal movement really. Birds feeding on mud flats and going back to the roost. There's very little use of the hinterland of the terrestrial field. And there's obviously the one bird at Long Barn Marsh which appear to switch roost during the winter. But overall, we know that waders are very tide faithful. They're around on sites and stay there all winter, but we're kind of surprised by the lack of interaction with other sites and movements really. So besides site fidelity, the interesting aspect really of the study is looking at habitat use and how curlew use the tidal flat versus the terrestrial habitat. So I mentioned that functional link land, which is the terrestrial habitat. And so plotted all the birds we've captured so far at birds from the Wellick salt marsh. And here we've only got 11% of the position recorded on a terrestrial field. Fixes is the position of the bird basically. Whereas along Barn Marsh, we've got 55% of the fixes of the position recording in terrestrial field. So there's a greater usage of the hinterland, the terrestrial field, by birds from the Long Barn Marsh, although it's based on a relatively small sample. But there's differences in in availability of habitat between the two sites really. So along Barn Marsh there's more around spur, there's a bit more coastal grassland. There's also the lack of maybe suitable roosting habitats in the salt marsh for the birds. So hence birds will use coastal grassland, especially pools in the coastal grassland, to roost at night. And they might use also coastal feed in daytime to top up the diet, really. Whereas at Wellick, they're very much a tidal feeder, really, and we've got a good data set, really. We'll probably sample 1%, 3% of the flock there by tracking birds. Another aspect of the tracking work really is looking at nocturnal and diurnal activity. So was mentioned that waders are very active at night, while Curlew is indeed very active at night. And in fact, the feeding patches really on the tidal flats in daytime and nighttime is very similar. So they feed in the same place. But there's differences at nighttime where there's clearly some sites, so you can see in black, are only used in nighttime. So some of the sites on the Wellick salt marsh, for example, are only used in nighttime. And there's very limited use of the fields in nighttime as well, the terrestrial field. I've just put in some more figures really to illustrate that pattern of use really. So able at Wellick, so you can see in yellow the daytime movement, in dark the black, in dark the nighttime movement. You can see there's more sites being used at nighttime on the salt marsh. So there's some roosts which are daytime, nighttime, and there's some roosts which are uniquely, exclusively nighttime roosts really. So if you see birds in daytime, it's more likely that they roost there at night. But you might come across some site where you don't suspect Curlew to be roosting there, but it could be a different story at night, really. Especially if it is kind of lagoons or shallow pools in the upper salt marsh. So again, to illustrate that differences between daytime and nighttime, really, you can see the foraging ground there, similar in between daytime and nighttime, but obviously greater use of sites at night. And again, and what is interesting about this is really, we could generate kind of hypothesis really why birds are expanding the distribution at night, and it could be linked to disturbance, for example. So we know, for example, at Wellick that there's a path there, so where it might be possible that the bird don't choose to roost there in daytime because of the disturbance. People walking up and down the bank. It could be the fact because of mammalian predation, like as was suggested. Birds at night are more wary of mammals, foxes, so they might look for water to roost. Hence, if there's any pools, shallow pools in the salt marsh, they will probably go there and find safety there. So there's a few things we've not really, really explained, but they could be related to disturbance. Another thing we could do with tracking data is looking at home ranges. So how much of a habitat the bird needs to survive the winter. So we calculated home ranges for, I put a sample of our birds really. So we could see that in orange, where the birds spend 90% of its time, in yellow or orange, and in blue, where the birds spend 50% of its time. So you could clearly see how site faithful they are. Very small orangery. The scale is 500 meters there. You could pinpoint roosting site and feeding site. There's a roosting site there. There's the feeding site. It's quite clear for some birds. Three roosting sites and a feeding site. And what it shows as well is the variation between individuals. So we've got birds with a small home range, other birds with a larger home range. And what is clear as well is the avoidance. There's clearly birds are avoiding feeding on lower shore at Wellick, which is a more sandy area. So there's no birds in that low shore area. What we're interested in as well is looking at the variation in home range. How much does it change throughout the year? So and between day and night. So throughout the winter, we've tracked birds from September all the way to April, and there's little variation in home range size really. So birds seems to, when they arrive on the wintering site, They adopt this routine, this pattern of use, really, is home range, and then stick to it throughout the winter, really, despite extreme weather events or changing food resources. So they're very consistent, very predictable, and there's no difference between day and night in terms of size. So the size is here on the axis, really. So it's around 500 hectares. There's not much difference between day and night, although we've seen in the previous slide that birds use different habitat between day and night, but the size is not is quite similar. So I mentioned viability. So it's clear that birds have different home range sizes. So I've just plotted the tracking data to illustrate that. Is because we know that waders have different behaviors throughout the winter, different strategies. Some is well known, like grey plover, for example, are very territorial. But we also know that some grey plover can be very territorial at first, so defend a territory, a patch. But then after, halfway through the winter, they might become non-territorial, while some birds are non-territorial all the way through the winter. And we can, through the Curlew tracking work, identify some of these behaviors. From the top, we've got, no distinctive behavior really, but clearly at the bottom, we've got, this distinctive feeding behavior on the tidal flats. So there we've got a couple of territories. We've got one distinctive territory here. So it's clearly birds, Curlew, have different strategies, which is reflected by in the territoriality. Well, we can't really judge whether one strategy is more effective than the other, but what we could say is there's different strategy really, and it's good to be aware of this really. Another thing we could do from the tracking data really is determine the behavior, and it's quite relevant really. So we've run an algorithm, this hidden Markov model. So based on the angle of turn, based on the distance between the time step, really the step between the position, we can identify the behavior of the bird. So in orange, the model classifies the point as resting, in blue as other activities, and from this really we can identify the roosting sites really, but most importantly we can identify the feeding pattern really, and pulling all the data together, we found that at Wellick, Curlew spend 20% of the time resting and 78% of the time engaged in other behaviors. And we found very little differences between day and night, so they carry on with the normal routine at night really, in terms of feeding and resting. There's a bit more resting at night, because obviously they can't really feed in the field at night. And we've gone through this with observation of Curlew at the site really. So you could see Curlew spend most of the time. This is real kind of observation, counting birds feeding and non-feeding. We could see that bird feed mostly around the low water period. Around the high water, there's more resting really, although there's some variability because bird might go into the field and feed at high water. So in conclusion, really, the GPS technology can be applied to get more data insight into home range, nocturnal activity, individual strategy, habitat use, and behavior. So we've seen that Curlew are very site faithful, very small home range. There's a lot of variability between individuals and no difference between in home range between day and night, although the pattern of habitat use is different. And the result really is the first step really. They're very relevant to kind of to the modeling of the impacts of the environmental changes on wader survival. That's key. We need to understand movement. We need to make the right assumptions about movement if we want to predict, with accuracy the impact of environmental changes on bird. But I guess the slightly downside of GPS tracking is, it's subject to a scientific approval from an independent panel at the BTO. The challenges of capturing waders is not easy, and there's also the tag longevity and price is still quite expensive really, and also you can only feed tags on medium to medium-sized bird really. So yeah, I must thanks all the all the ringers from the Humber Reading Group and the Spurn Estuary and Yorkshire Trust and Path Tracks and Humber Nature Partnership for support with the funding. Thank you.
Excellent, Luca. Thank you very much. That's a fascinating talk. Lots of questions in already, so I'm just going to get straight on with them if that's okay. 2 questions, one from Africa, one from Andrew Gibson, both similar topic. So Africa says, did you see any differences between male and female niche differences and home ranges? And Andrew says, is there a sexual difference in the birds tagged on the 2 sites that may account for the feeding site usage? The 2 related questions there.
Yeah, I think it's 2 related questions. We could answer into one really. We looked at difference between male and female. As you know, male has got a shorter bill than the female, but we couldn't find any differences really, partly because maybe our sample of bird is quite small, and partly because our birds are mainly tidal feeder already. So, but it's obviously with a bigger sample, there's potential to explore even a bit more of this. But yeah, no differences between male and female. Yeah, and there's no really bias in sex from the long bar marsh. I think we caught a split of male and female at the site.
Excellent, thanks, Luca. A question from Nick. What program do you use to make the animations of the movements?
Yes, so I use a package called MoveViz. I think it's quite straightforward to use really, and you could use it's an R package, a MoveViz package really. I'm happy to put the name of the package in the chat if you want.
Yeah, perfect. That'd be excellent, yeah. Luke. Thank you. Question from Jim Wright. Do you have any supplementary data about specific breeding locations in Scandinavia or elsewhere of the curlews that overwinter in the Humber?
Yeah, so we've had a number of because we're coloring curlew on the Humber, so we've had a number of reciting on mainly in Finland, I think, and I think Sweden as well. But most of our birds come from, based on the analysis of BTO ringing data already from the wash, most of birds come from the northeast, Russia and Finland and Sweden.
Excellent. The question this time from Nick Cutts. Does resting time percentage change over time, for example, through the winter?
Yeah, so I've not really broken it down. Good question, but I don't know really kind of looked at differences between months really. So I've looked at over the winter period, because I don't think I've got sufficient data to do that. But it'd be interesting to see whether there's a change really, and I suspect there will be a change. With more pressure to feed in winter and during the hard winter months, and increase feeding activity really to compensate for that.
Excellent, thanks, Luca. One final question before we move on. A question here: have all of your tagged curlew come back to your site each autumn, or do many discover new sites?
Yeah, so with the color ringing, I'm not, I've seen that birds are very site faithful and coming back to the same site really. So although we've got evidence of sites, or there's also birds that may start using a site and then finally a few weeks later come back to the final wintering site really. But yes, most of our birds come back to the same site really, where they were tagged.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Luca. It was great questions again and great answers.